This is a reading, A Long Walk to Water, based on a true story. Tragic and Heroine. Published weekly in Starred Review by Linda Sue Park. Newbery medalist for Single Shard. A #1 New York Times bestseller. ISBN number 978-0-547-57731-9. A Long Walk to Water, in English, by Linda Sue Park, based on a true story. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, Boston, New York. Map of Sudan, 1958. To Ben again. Chapter 1. Southern Sudan, 2008. Going was easy. Going, a big plastic container held only air. Tall for her 11 years, Lina could switch the handle from hand to the other, swinging the container by her side to cradle in both arms. She could even drag it behind her, bumping it against the ground and raising up a tiny cloud of dust with each step. There was little weight going. There was only heat, the sun already baking the air. Even though it was long before noon, it would take her half the morning if she didn't stop on the way. Heat, time, and thorns. Southern Sudan, 2008. Chapter 1. Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva sat cross-legged on the bench. He kept his head turned toward the front, hands folded back perfectly straight. Everything about him was paying attention to the teacher, everything except his eyes and his mind. His eyes kept flicking towards the window, through which he could only see the road, only the road home. Just a little while longer, a few minutes more, he would be walking on that road. The teacher droned on with a lesson about the Arabic language. Salva spoke the language of Dinka tribe at home, but in school he learned Arabic, the official language of the Sudanese government, far away to the north. 11-year-old, on his last birthday, Salva was a good student. He already knew the lesson, which was why he was letting his mind wander down the road ahead of his body. Salva was well aware of how lucky he was to be able to go to school. He could not attend the entire year because during the dry season his family moved far away from their village, but during the rainy season he could walk to the school, which is only half an hour from his home. Salva's first was a successful man. He owned many head of cattle and worked as village judge. On honor, respect, and position, Salva had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Each boy reached the age of about 10 years. He was sent off to school. Salva's older brother, Arik and Rang, had gone to school before him. Last year, it had been Salva's turn. His 2 sisters, Akik and Agathna, did not go to school. Just like other girls in the village, they started at home and learned from their mothers how to keep the house. Most of the time, Salva glad to be home, to be able to go to school. But some days she wished she was back at her home herding cattle. He and his brothers, along with some sons of his fathers and other wives, would walk the herds to the water holes where there was good grazing, and the responsibilities depending on how old they were. Salva's younger brother, Khaled, was taking care of just one cow, like his brothers before him. He'd be able to be in charge of more cows every year. Before Silva had begun going to school, he had helped look after the entire herd, and his younger brother as well. The boys had kept an eye on the cows, but the cows did not really need much care. That left plenty of time to play. Selva had other boys made cows out of clay, and more cows you made, the richer you were. But they had been fine, healthy animals. It took time to make a lump of clay look like a cow. The boys would challenge each other to see how they could make the best cows. Other times they would practice with their bows and arrows shooting at small animals or birds. They weren't very good at it yet, but once in a while they got lucky. And those were the best days, when one of them managed to kill a ground squirrel or a rabbit, a guinea hen, or a grouse. The boys' aimless play halted, and there was suddenly a lot of work to do. Some of them gathered wood to build a fire, others helped clean and dress the animals. Then aroused, they roasted on the fire. None of this took place quietly. Salva had his own opinion on how the fire should be built and how long the meat needed to cook, and she did so of each other. The fire needs to get bigger, and it won't last long enough. We need more wood. No, it's big enough already. Quickly turned over before it was ruined. The juices dripped and sizzled, and the delicious smell filled the air. Finally, they could not wait 1 second longer, and there was only enough for each boy to have a few bites. But oh, how delicious those bites were. Sylvia swallowed and turned his eyes back toward the teacher. He wished he had called those times because memories made him hungry. Milk, and he got home, but would have a bowl of fresh milk, which would keep his belly full until supper time. And just how it would be, his mother would raise from her work gilded, grinded meal and around to see the other side of the house that faced the road. She would stay shaded with her eyes with one hand, search for him. From far off would see her bright orange headscarf, and that would raise his arm in greetings. By the time he reached the house, she would have gone inside to get her bowl of milk ready for him. Cracked the noise and come from outside. Was a gunshot or just a car backfire? The teacher stopped for a moment. Every head in the room turned towards the window. Nothing. Silence. The teacher had cleared her throat, which drew the boys' attention to the front of the room again, and this continued with the lesson of where they had come off and had led. Then crack, pop, pop, crack, attack, gunfire. Everyone down, the teacher shouted. Some of the boys had moved at once, ducking their heads and hunched over. Others had frozen, and their eyes had mounted with a wide open. Selma covered her head with his hands and looked from side to side in panic. Each teacher edged his way along the wall to see the window. He took a quick peek outside, and the gunfire had stopped, but now people were shouting and running. Go quickly, all of you, the teacher said, his low voice and urgent. To the bush. Do you hear me? Not home. Don't run home. They'll be going to the villages. Swaying away from the village. Run to the bush. He went to the door and looked out again. Go, all of you now. The war had started 2 years early. Salva did not understand how much about it, but he knew that the rebels from the southern part of Sudan and his family were fighting against the government, which was based in north. Most of the people who lived in the north were Muslim, and the government wanted all the Sudan to become Muslim country, a place where the beliefs of Islam were followed. The people in the south were a different people's religion and did not want to be forced into practicing Islam. They began fighting the independent from the north, and fighting was scarce around the southern Sudan, and how the war had become where Selva lived. The boys scrambled to their feet, and some of them were crying. The teacher began hurrying the students out the door. Silva had the near end of the line, felt his heart beating so hard that the pulse pounded in his throat and the ears. He wanted to shout, I need to go home. I must go home. But other words, blocked by the wind, trumped in his throat. When he got to the door, he looked out. Everyone was running, men, children, women carrying babies, and the air was full of dust, and they had been kicked up by those running feet. Some of the men were shouting, and waving guns. Silva saw that this was one glance, and he was running too, running as hard as he could to the bush, away from home. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya put on the container down and sat on the ground. She always tried not to step on the spiky plants that grew along the path, but their thorns littered the ground everywhere. She looked at the bottom of her foot, and there it was, a big thorn had broken off right in the middle of her heel, and it pushed the skin around the thorn, and then she picked up another thorn and used it to poke and prod at the first one. She pressed her lips together against the pain. Southern Sudan, 1985. Boom. Silva turned and looked behind him, and a huge black cloud of smoke arose. Flames darted out of its base. Other head of a jet plane veered away like a sleek, evil bird. In the smoke and dust, he could see the school building anymore. He tripped and fell almost. No more looking back. It slowed him down. Silva lowered his head and ran. He ran until he could not run anymore, and then he walked for hours until the sun was nearly gone from the sky. Other people were walking too. There were so many of them that they couldn't all be from the school village. They must have been come from this whole area. As Silva walked, the same thoughts kept going, though through the rhyme of the steps where they were going. Where was the family? When will I see them again? The people stopped walking, and it grew too dark to see the path. At first, someone stood around the uncertainty, speaking in tense whispers and silent with fear. With some of the men gathering and walked for a few moments, one could call them out. Villages. Grouping your slaves by villages, and you find someone you know. Silva wandered around until he heard that the words Al-Liak, the village of Al-Liak here, relief flooded through him, and this was his village. He hurried towards the sound of the voice. A dozen or so people stood in a loose at the ground side. In the road, Silva scanned her face, and there was no from his family. He recognized a few people, a woman with his baby, two men, a teenage girl, but no one knew well still that confronting to see them. He spent the night right at the end of the road, and the men taking shifts to keep him watch. The next morning they began walking again. Silva straight ahead in the midst of the crowd, with other villages from Loganstick. And after the noons, they saw a large group of soldiers up ahead, rolled past at the crowd, and the rebels. Those were fighting against the government. Silva passed rebels, soldiers waiting by the side of the road. Each of them held a big gun, and they were not pointed at the crowd, but even so, the soldiers seemed fierce and watchful. Some of the rebels joined back of the line, and now the villages were more surrounded. Where are they going to do to us? Where's my family? Late in the day, villagers arrived in the rebel camps, and the soldiers ordered the spare to the groups, and the men groups of women, children, and the elderly, and together teenage boys, it seemed, were considered men, for boys who looked to only be a few years older than Silva were joining the men's group. Sylvia hesitated for a moment, but he was only 11, but he was the son of an important family. He knew that Salva Mawini Dot Alkik, the man of the village named for his grandfather, his father always told him to act like a man, to follow example of older brother, in turn set a good example for Kyle. Silva took a few steps towards the men. Hey, soldiers approached Silva and raised his gun. Silva's froze, and all I could see was a gun and a huge barrel, black gleaming, and the movement towards his face. The end of the barrel touched his chin. Silva felt his knees turn to the water. He closed his eyes. If I die now, I'll never see my family again. Somehow he thought it strengthened him enough to keep him from collapsing in terror. He took a deep breath, his eyes opened, and he was holding a gun with only one hand. He was aiming it and using it to lift Silva's chin so he could get a better look at his face. Over there, the soldier said. He said, move the gun, and pointed it towards a group of women and children. You are not a man yet. Don't be in such a hurry. He laughed and clapped Silva on the other shoulder. Silva scurried over to the woman and said, the next morning, the rebels moved from on the camp. The villages were in force and carried the supplies and guns, mortars, shells, and radio equipment. Silva watched as one man protested and did not want to go to the rebels. The soldier hit his face, the butt of the gun. The man fell to the ground, bleeding. After that, one object and shouldered the heavy equipment with his left camp. Everyone else began walking again and went to the opposite direction from the rebels. For wherever the rebels went, there was sure to be a fight. Silva sang with the group at the lower courtyard. This was smaller now, without men. Except for the infant, Silva was the only child. In that evening, they found that the barn in which to spend the night. Silva tossed restlessly in an itchy hay. Where are you going? Where's my family? What will I see them again? It will take him a long time to fall asleep. Even before he was fully awake, Silva could not feel that something was going wrong. He lay very still with his eyes closed and tried to sense that he might be finally upset and open his eyes. No one else in that barn. Silva stood quickly for that moment. He felt dizzy. He rushed to the door and looked out. Nobody, nothing. He felt that he had him. He was alone. Into Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Southern Sudan, 2008. They smuggled on the horizon, glazed the color. Naya knew drew near, changing the face and gazing gray to olive green. The dirt under the feet turned to mud and sludge. Under the last, she had ankle deep in water. She was always in much life around the pond. Other people, mostly women, girls, those had come to fulfill their own container. Many of the kinds of birds, all the flap, the twitter and caw, herds of the cattle that brought them to good grazing by the young boys who took after them. Nia took and hollowed the gowd that she was tied to the handle of the plastic container. She untied it and scooped it to her brown muddy water and drank. It took 2 godfuls before she felt a little cooler inside. Nia filled the container all the way to the top. She said, tied to the ground in place. It took a pad of cloth from their pocket, went to the water first, following by the headed container of water, which she would hold in place in one hand, and then water balanced on her head with the foot still sore from the thorn. Nad knew that she would go home and take longer than coming had. She might have reached home by noon if it all went well. Southern Sudan, 1985. The tears of the hot Sevia's eyes, which everyone was gone. They had left without walking. He knew the answer because it was a small child who might tire easy and slowed them down. He complained about being hungry because of the trouble somehow. I would not have been in trouble. I would not have complained. What will they do now? Sylvia took a few steps to see what he could see. On the far horizon, the sky had haze from the smoke of the bombs. 100 pieces in front of him. He could see a small pond. Between the pond and the barns was a house, and a woman sitting in the sun, holding his breath. He creeped closer until could see that her face clearly. The ritual scar patterns on her forehead were familiar, and the dunk patterns which meant that she was from the same tribe as Sylvia. Sylvia let his breath of relief, Nia glad that she was not a neuter, and the Danka had long history in trouble. No one, it seems, were sure of the newer land. In it, the Danka clan began to see each tribe tried to lay claim to the areas richest in water. Over the years, there had been many battles, large and small, between Danka and Nur, and the people both sides had been killed. This was not the same as the war that was going on now between the rebels and the government. The Danker and the Nur had begun fighting each other for hundreds of years. The woman looked up and saw him. Sylvia flinched at her glance and could be befriended. To be a stranger would be angry for him to be spending the night in her barn, but at least he was not alone now. It was now the edge of the stronger, and uncertainty about the woman might not be sated him. He might walk to her, "Good morning, Auntie," instead of the voice trembling. He said, nodding at him. He was old, much older now than Sylvia's mother. He kept quiet, waiting for her to speak. "You must be hungry," she said at last, and stood and went to the house. A few moments later, he came back and go out to him with handfuls of raw peanuts. She said and sat down again. "Sylvia, thank you, Auntie," squatted on his hunches and said to her. Sylvia shelled the nuts and ate them. He chewed every nut into paste before he swallowed, trying to make each one last as long as he could. The woman sat unspeaking until he was finished, and said and asked, "Where are you? Are you the people?" Sylvia opened her mouth to speak, but his eyes filled with tears again, and could not answer. She frowned. "Are you an orphan?" She took her head quickly for a moment, and he felt that almost angry that he was not an orphan. He had a father and a mother, and he had the family. It was at school that I ran away from the fight. "I do not know where my family is," she said. "A bad thing, this war. What are you going to do now? How will you find them?" Sylvia had no answer. He hoped that the woman might have answered him. After all, she was an adult. Instead, he had only one question. Everything was upside down. Sylvia said to the woman in the barn. Again at that night, he began to make a plan. "Maybe I can stay here until the fight stopped. Then we'll go back to my village and find my family." He worked hard to see that it would not send him away. For 3 days he fetched firewood from the bush and the water from the pond, but the pond was drying up. Each day it was harder to fill the grouts, and during the daytime Sylvia could not hear the distant booming of artillery from the fight a few miles away. Even with every shell exposed, he would not think of his family, hoping that they were safe, wondering desperately when he would be with them again. On the 4th day, the old woman told him that she was leaving. "You have seen that the pond is only a puddle now. Winter is coming in the dry season." And the fighting and the nodding her head in the direction of the noise. "It will go to the different village of near water. You cannot stay with me any longer." Sylvia started at the panic rose inside of him. "Why can't you go with her?" The woman spoke again. Before she could go, ask aloud. "The soldiers will not leave me alone. The older woman on her own. It would be more dangerous for me to travel with you." She shook her head in sympathy. "I'm not sorry. I can't help you anymore," she said. "Everywhere you go it is where you walk. Just be sure where you walk is away from the fighting." Sylvia trembled back to the barn. "What will I do? Where will I go?" The words repeated themselves 1,000 times in his head. It was no strange. He had known the old woman for only a few days, but now he could not go and imagine where he can go to do it once she was gone. He sat inside the barn and started out, looking at nothing. As though it grew dimmer, the noise of even began, the buzz of insects, and the rustle of dry leaves, and the other sounds of voices. Sylvia turned his head towards the sound. Yes, it was a voice. Some people were walking towards the house, a small group, fewer than a dozen. As they approached, Sylvia took a sharp breath. In the fading light, he could see that the face of those nearest to him, 2 men, had patterns of V-shaped scars on their forehead, darker patterns again, and the kind of that were given to the boys at Sylvia's village as part of the ritual of becoming a man. These people were Dunkirk too, would finally see his family be among them. Into chapter 3, page 20. Lina Sue Parks, A Long Walk to Water, based on a true story.